But then, once you kind of start to discover all the German bands, you realise that there were entire albums that were made of electronics.
Whilst the Human League dreamt of pop, Cabaret Voltaire were anything but, using electronics to explore Sheffield, a city torn between the past and the future.
I remember watching loads of science fiction things in the 60s, like Doctor Who and things like Quatermass. And all these kind of strange things seem to happen in kind of old gasworks or industrial environment. There was another worldliness about it. You might see an alien or a giant blob creeping across the floor, glowing bright green from radioactivity.
Very arty group. Obviously their name echoes Dada. They were really into William Burroughs and his ideas of like control and surveillance. They actually used quite a lot of guitar, but it was so heavily processed it didn't sound like rock and roll guitar. It sounded more like a synthesizer. They also put synthesizing type effects on the voice, which is probably one of the most disturbing things they did. You have a guy singing, but it sounds more like a Dalek than a human being.
At night time you'd hear distant booming noises, which would probably be something like a drop forge or steam hammer or something. You certainly knew that you were on the edge of heavy industry.
Everything in their music was kind of alienated, and the music that comes from people who are kind of divorced from any kind of natural life, any natural rhythms, the music for a kind of hostile environment.
If I've ever been asked to explain that movement, I always call it the alienated synthesists. And Throbbing Gristle, Cabaret Voltaire, Joy Division, who were a little bit less obviously synthy. Everyone was sort of like that. We were all going around in long coats from second-hand shops and saying how terrible things were with a synth.
Across the Pennines, another pocket of alienated synthesists dreamt of an electronic future in the spiritual home of British pop music.
We are in Matthew Street in Liverpool, and I'm actually standing outside of the door to what used to be Eric's Club, which is where we played our first gig, where we invented OMD to play at this place. And it was, of course, the club where we all used to come. The Bunnymen and the Teardrops played within a month of us playing here as well. This was a place I saw Devo play their first English concert, and all of the influential bands that we could get to come to town played here, apart from Kraftwerk, who played the big theatre down the road. And then literally 10 yards away is the Cavern Club. You've got Eric's and the Cavern right across the road from each other. When Paul and I started being interested in electronic music, we were very young. We had no money, and it was totally unrealistic to think about getting, the big kind of keyboards that you saw on TV or on stage with some of the keyboard players in the 70s. My mother had a K's mail order catalogue, and they had some synthesizers. Our first Korg micro preset was bought from my mother's catalogue for 36 weeks at $7.76 a week, I seem to recall.
This was the first synth, and we'd made the first two albums with this, and it's like, it's quite a basic synth. Can you believe that's the record?
The major record labels largely ignored synth music, forcing bands like OMD to look to newly formed indies instead. In 1978, OMD would sign to Factory. A movement of sorts was beginning to coalesce.
I think the first wave of bands that sort of came out of the closet in the late 70s, we were all working independently of each other. There was no unified movement. It didn't all start in one club or one town. There was no gang of people who all had a manifesto that we were going to do the new British electronic music. It was small pockets of people in different parts of the country who were independently, obviously listening to the same things.
I did make an electronic drum machine, but I'd seen Kraftwerk with their sticks, so I thought I can make one of those, and so I did. And so some of the early sort of synth drums was this sort of very Heath Robinson looking box with all these plates on there with these sort of sticks with wires that we did the drums to electricity.
We were horrified when Tony Wilson said, you know, what you do is the future of pop. We're like, pop? Yeah, we're experimental, German influenced. You know, we're not pop at all. How dare you call us pop? We were absolutely mortified. We couldn't see it at all. Totally by accident, Paul and I guess others at the time, had distilled the electronic experimentation and the kind of glam pop of Britain from just a few years earlier into what was going to become, which didn't seem at the time, but was going to become the future of pop music.
By the start of 1979, the future of pop music seemed a long way off, as the combined efforts of the Normal, OMD and the Human League had failed to trouble the charts. But dabbling in synthesizers was becoming increasingly de rigueur, even for dyed-in-the-wool punks. At the other end of the East Lancs Road, another factory band, who would become one of the greatest electronic acts, were taking their first synthetic steps.
The first synthesizer we had in Joy Division was a little thing called a Transcendent 2000, and I actually built it from a load of components. At the time I had insomnia and I couldn't sleep very well. So I used to get this magazine called Electronics Today or something like that, and in it was this synthesizer, and if you were to buy one in those days it was incredibly expensive and we didn't have any money, so I thought, well, this is really cheap, it's only like 200 quid, and how difficult can it be to build it? And it was like soldering components in, by hand. It took about 2 months of doing that. And then it didn't work incredibly well, I remember we went to write a track in a studio called Cargo in Rochdale, and when we went in, we found a little Woolworths organ that you switched the battery power, switched it on and it blew a fan. You could play chord buttons on it, so I was messing about with these chord buttons, and then Martin Hannett, I think, had brought in a Selena string synth, and you can play more than one note at a time on it. So I got the organ and the synthesizer and hit these chord buttons and wrote Atmosphere, Joy Division track, and just seemed to write it there in the studio. I think we wrote the music, and then Ian wrote the words that night, and then recorded the vocals the next day, which is amazing when I think about it now.
Always danger, endless talking, life rebuilding, don't walk away.
Whilst it seemed the North had the lead in post-punk synth pioneers, things were also stirring down south.